Senator Cornyn, thank you so much. Really do appreciate your time. Wanted to ask you about this business immunity legislation that you're working on. What is being developed right now, and what are you developing?
Well, after every major disaster, whether it's 9/11 or you may even remember Y2K, where we were worried that all the computers were going to melt down because of the way that changed, they would change over or not after the turn of the century. Congress has provided some safe harbor for people who basically follow government guidance. And so what we're trying to do is use that precedent to see what makes sense. We want to make sure that people who have legitimate claims have recourse. That's what we are as a country. We believe in people getting access to the courts where they're legitimate claims, but we also know that this could be an opportunity for people to abuse the system and basically discourage employers from, even by following guidance, doing it safely to protect them from that frivolous litigation.
So essentially, how would this work? In other words, is this a case where if a business is following the recommendations from the CDC or their association, the state, the county health department, then they would be immune from these lawsuits?
That would be a requirement to for them to prevail. But basically, as you know, that it's not just the winning the lawsuit; it's the expense of litigation as well. But right now, we're at the early stages of figuring out whether this should be a part of what the plaintiff or the person bringing the lawsuit should have to disprove or prove that they did not follow guidance, or whether this would be something that the business would then say, well, I'm sorry that it turned out this way, but we followed all the appropriate guidance, and so you can't hold me liable. Part of this is going to be, the biggest part maybe of reopening is going to be public confidence, and also the incentives for the business owners to actually take the risk of reopening. And so we're all going to have to do this together, but we're just trying to chart some way to safely be able to reopen. And the best way to do that is by following the guidance of people like the Center for Disease Control. And if people do that, then I don't think they should be held liable for following that authoritative guidance.
And so, if I hear you correctly, this wouldn't necessarily prevent a lawsuit from being filed. The lawsuit would still be filed, but a judge would have to find that the business complied with all of the recommendations from the CDC, the local and state health departments, et cetera?
That's basically the idea. We also, I think, try to encourage these cases to be consolidated so that they could be treated the same. As you know, part of what lawyers do is they look for favorable jurisdictions in which to file lawsuits. They call that forum shopping, and that is part of the modern litigation. But what we would try to do is find a way to consolidate these similar cases so they can be decided perhaps by the same court in a similar manner. And again, I think that would provide some predictability, some continuity, but it's at the same time make sure that people who do have just cases could get their day in court and get the relief that they have demonstrate they're entitled to.
Would they have to be filed in a federal court in your mind? And I mean, obviously there are different jurisdictions within the federal court system. So would they be required to be consolidated in one jurisdiction by one judge?
Well, in the federal courts, ordinarily you have to demonstrate that it affects interstate commerce. And so I think given the nature of this pandemic, it's not just interstate, it's global in nature. But the idea would be that even cases filed in state court would then be removed to federal court and then consolidated and treated in a similar fashion. Again, this would provide a forum for the plaintiff who brings the lawsuit, who believes that they've been unfairly injured or damaged or became ill as a result of something that the defendant did, but it would provide us a little bit more continuity, a little more predictability. And I think it would, in the end, help us safely reopen, which is the goal.
And do you believe that if there is wrongful conduct, though, that is proven, that that business should be held liable?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the standard, the question is, what would the standard be? Would it be a negligence standard? Would it be a reckless disregard? My view is that we ought to make sure that people who recklessly disregard the safety of others or that engage in willful conduct, that those are the folks that need to be held accountable. People that are doing the best they can, but through no fault of their own, that something turns out to cause this virus to spread. I think those ought to be the ones that are offered this safe harbor.
And what would you say to those who would say this is very anti-consumer?
Well, we're having to balance all the equities. This is unprecedented. Nobody's ever lived through this before. The closest thing I can think of is the great influenza virus of 100 years ago. It killed tens of millions of people. Again, we're doing the best we can in very unpredictable circumstances. But I do know that it is important at some point for us to emerge from our homes and our computer screens and go and try to resume life as we once knew it. And that means the slow but safe reopening of our businesses and that our economy depends on. Congress is being asked to send, we've already sent $150 billion in assistance to state and local government because they don't have the sales tax collections that they need in order to support basic services like law enforcement and fire and the like. The only way our cities and our counties and our state and our nation are going to get through this is to slowly but safely find a way to reopen. Obviously, it will be gradual.
And just one other question on the legislation you are trying to craft there. Who else are you talking to in the Senate, and are you talking to anybody in the House? And what is your timetable to introduce such legislation and then get this through?
Well, we're still at the preliminary stages and be reaching out to other members of the Senate on both sides of the aisle, and of course to our colleagues in the House. You can't get something like this done without bipartisan support, but that's why it's important to recognize the precedent from other incidents, other emergencies like 9/11, Y2K, and the like, where Congress has come together to offer this sort of safe harbor and protection while allowing justified claims. But I think Senator McConnell has made pretty clear that this will be part of the next big piece of legislation to pass the Congress. Speaker Pelosi, I understand, is going to release a bill maybe tonight, which will involve several $1 trillion of additional spending. And obviously, that's the wish list she has. But this is going to be a part of any negotiated outcome, some liability protections to give people the confidence that they can follow guidance from the public health officials and then safely begin to reopen.
And one of the things that I was reading is that Senators Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders and perhaps others are proposing a monthly income until this coronavirus threat passes, or perhaps until there's a vaccine, for people who make less than $120,000. I think it was about $2,000 a month. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to people who, through no fault of their own, have lost their job and aren't getting a paycheck. That's why we've already spent roughly $3 trillion to try to help them and the small businesses that employ them. But this should not be used to subsidize people who are getting an income, and it shouldn't be used to try to accomplish your ideological wish list. To me, it seems like they're going too far in offering this money to people who are being paid, and if you want to talk about targeting it to people who, through no fault of their own, are not getting an income, then I'm willing to listen. But just using this as in order to deal with your to pursue or advance your ideological wish list is not something I'd be interested in.
You spoke before about assistance to local and state governments. I know Texas, for example, the Congress passed, as part of the CARES Act, $11.2 billion in assistance to the state of Texas. And I was wondering, how much more do you envision going to state and local governments? And do
Well,
you,
we're in regular conversation with the mayors and county judges in North Texas and elsewhere. But you're right, $11.2 billion has already been paid out. One of the things some of the mayors have been telling me is that, well, we don't necessarily want any more money now, but we do want the flexibility to spend the money you've sent us in ways that will help us meet our payroll. And of course, local government does provide essential services like law enforcement and fire protection, just to mention a couple. And we're going to work with them to try to meet their needs. Hopefully, they can begin to generate some more sales tax revenue and support their own local government function. But if they can't, as a result of this virus, then we're going to work together to help them.
and the city of Dallas just announced that they are going to be furloughing 472 employees. And I was just wondering, when they talk about the flexibility that they need, do you support that?
Yeah, I've talked to Mayor Johnson about that, and I know any of these layoffs are painful, not only to the people who've been laid off, but also to the leaders who have to make those decisions. We'll be continuing to work with the mayor and the judge to make sure that that the federal government steps up and helps. Again, we can't stay locked down forever and expect our economy to come back along with the sales tax revenue necessary to support these essential services. So that's why we're trying to do a number of things at the same time when we safely reopen. But we've already appropriated about $11.2 billion for Texas, and we're going to continue to work with our state and local leaders to make sure that they have what they need in order to protect our citizens. That's our job.
And I know Congress has also passed money that goes to local health centers and counties as far as more testing is concerned. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and your level of satisfaction that there are enough tests out there for people to have so that we know who's positive and whether they should, we can get them isolated?
Well, as you know, the number of tests in Texas and around the country have rapidly escalated. We've really started almost from scratch, and now there's a multitude of different types of tests that are available. Unfortunately, there are so many different types of tests. Some of them have proven to be unreliable, and that's a real problem. So we're trying to figure that out. But so far, to my knowledge, if you have symptoms of the coronavirus and your doctor recommends you be tested, those tests are available. We're trying to come up with a faster test, and Abbott Laboratories, for example, has got one where you can do it in 5 minutes. But they obviously have a factory line they need to expand to build those sorts of tests. In the meantime, the one that probably is the most promising is the antibody testing that can be done in doctors' offices. The Food and Drug Administration just approved an emergency request for authorization for a new line of these antibody tests. What we're learning is that there are a lot of people that don't have symptoms, have had the virus, as indicated by the antibodies that are in their blood, part of their body's immune response system. In New York, for example, I think Mayor Cuomo said in one sample they took, as many as 10 times the people who tested positive had antibodies, which indicates that there's a whole lot of other people who are asymptomatic and who are spreading potentially the disease. I think this really emphasizes the importance of protecting the most vulnerable, our seniors and people with underlying health problems. For the rest of us, if you're healthy and you're younger, you're at low risk, but obviously there is a very vulnerable population for whom this can be lethal. So I would prioritize them and then make sure that people are exercising all the sort of personal hygiene and protective measures like wearing masks when you're in public. Those are the sorts of things that are going to help us get through this.
I wanted to ask you about the reopening of the Texas economy. Are you satisfied with the pace of it? As you know, some Democrats have said the state is opening too fast, too soon. Some conservatives say it's not reopening fast enough. Where are you on this?
Well, so in other words, nobody's happy, Jack. It sounds like, well, it's obviously a balance. And I think Governor Abbott has done a good job. I think our mayors and county judges have done a good job. I don't expect all of them to look at this exactly the same, but we have to make a decision and we have to move forward. I think the best thing to do is to gradually begin to reopen, and then we pump the brakes. We look around, we see, do we have any hot spots? Do we have any problems? If not, then let's continue to reopen. At the same time, we've got about 90 different clinical trials underway for a cure, and obviously ultimately a vaccine. Ultimately, that will be the thing that relegates the coronavirus to the same status as the seasonal flu, is that vaccine.